And what I was trying to see exactly was the original word. The word that we see in our Bible is beast, talking about the Antichrist, means a wild animal. So it's a code name. It was used to keep people from figuring out that he was talking about a political figure, and I was going to show you some stuff here in a minute. And so a lot of the symbolic language uses words like that. And then, of course, Daniel uses the different animals, lion and so forth. So when it comes to trying to understand Revelation, I've heard people come up with a lot of interpretations. I remember years ago when the computers started really getting good, as the internet got developed, one of the super computers that was used to drive the military, the military had the internet first, and then the government, FCC, started releasing wavelengths and things like that, and it began to expand. And so the military had control of information, but now it's become public. One of the supercomputers they had, they call it the Beast. And it was used for data collecting and things like that. And people referred to it as the Beast. And I remember reading a couple of books where the people who wrote the book said, we're going to be controlled by a computer and all this stuff. I don't really put much stock in that, but since there's not much information in the Bible, we have to kind of fill in the gaps as best we can. But look in your Bibles in 1 John. I meant to show you this last week, and I didn't do it. In 1 John chapter 4.
Pastor Bob, why is words in there like code words? I had just heard this somewhere in discussion that John he was isolated so long, that he may have been seeing something else and hallucinating, but he wasn't.
No, if we had been living back then, we would look at Revelation entirely different. That's the problem, that now we are in the 21st century. We don't know the exact figurative language he was using. We can only speculate and use Daniel and Ezekiel and some of the Old Testament books to come up with some ideas. Because even Daniel doesn't mention, he doesn't mention the Roman Empire, because that didn't take place. But people associate that last beast as being the Roman Empire. And then in Revelation, there's nothing about Rome. However, most people believe that the resurrection of those, 10 heads and stuff is a 10-nation conglomerate out of the old Roman Empire. And I showed you kind of a rough map. But the reason for the code language, there were certain times in the Roman Empire where they came against Christians pretty harshly, depending on the emperor. When this particular event was going on and he was writing Revelation, there was an emperor by the name of Domitian, okay? He was the one who probably did the most to harm Christians than any of the other emperors, though they harmed them. Domitian was the leader of, persecuting Christians. And so John was exiled to the island of Patmos because he was the last living apostle. All the other apostles had died. And Jesus had predicted that, not predicted, but prophesied that in John, that, he would be the last one. And so he came under scrutiny, and rather than killing him, because what the Romans learned through persecution of Christians, if you kill a leader, they multiply, because people see him as a martyr, and it just makes people's faith become more bold. And the Romans learned that, so they quit, killing the leaders and started taking out, different segments. But anyway, so when you're in persecution, and it's just like Daniel, he was living in a foreign land. You use lion and, animals and stuff like that to represent certain kingdoms. Well, what happens is, because you're living in perilous times and the government around you is against you, then if you want to communicate hope for your people, you wrote in such a way as to let them know things are bad, but God is not gone yet. He's still in control. They call it apocalyptic literature, okay? And when you look at Daniel, and you look at Ezekiel and all of those, apocalyptic means revelation. So what they do is they write in Mark 13, all of the book of Revelation. That's a big word, but basically it says is they write in hidden terms to be revealed later. But you see, if you've been living then, you would know what those terms meant, and you would associate. Us in the 21st century, we can only look back. And then as time goes along, this meaning Revelation, as time goes along and as events unfold, if we know our Bible, and remember Jesus gave all kinds of signs to look for. What were some of them? Wars, rumors of wars. What were some of the other ones? Earthquakes. Paul says children are going to become rebellious, break up of the home, sensuality is going to increase. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just going to be an increase of violence, as it was in the days of Noah. Jesus said to look for those signs, and when you see them happening, know that your redemption is getting close, okay? And then we have the marker of Israel. God still uses Israel as an indicator of what he's doing in the world. Prophetically, the prophets talked about Israel being restored. Ezekiel talked about that. They talked about one day the temple being rebuilt and everything being restored to its former glory, that Israel would have, power and so forth, and the temple would be reestablished. And so that to be said, this type of literature, like the book of Revelation, has a lot of code language for us to try to unwind and figure out. And then some people, and I've told you this before, and I'm glad I went to seminary and got under people who are much more smarter than me and know more of the Bible than I do. I'm talking about Dr. Lee and some others. They were geniuses at all this stuff. One of the biggest things they said and cautioned us about is don't fall into the trap, if it's not in the Bible, of putting into the Bible things what you think it is for your generation. He said if you do that, he said you almost become a false prophet because there's not anything specifically there. So when it talks about the mark of the beast, we just know this character has, like a wild beast, he's uncontrollable. He can't be tamed. Whereas if you use the other word for a domesticated animal, you can tame them. So they use the word beast to indicate that this political leader, and then he has a religious counterpart, that both of them are uncontrollable as far as, anything going on, because Satan he's in these guys and he's using them. Someone said they're like, Hitler had a term where people talked about Hitler and said he had henchmen, people in his upper echelon that did his dirty work. Well, these two guys are working for Satan. They're on earth. They're actually in political positions and religious positions, and they're going to work against the remaining believers who are there in the tribulation. And we'll see some of that tonight. So all I can say to you is that the only reason they use code language is to keep from being discovered. So if a Roman soldier picked up one of these documents and they were passing it around, it would look like a story with animals and stuff like that. Nothing about Rome. In one of Peter's letters he wrote, he referred to Babylon as a code word for Rome, for the Roman Empire. And he talked about Babylon. Well, we see Babylon in the book of Revelation, which could indicate Rome. Some people seem to think America, as we move away from God, we're resurrecting some of the old Roman, principles. Our government is based on Roman and Greek government and so forth. And some people seem to think that in one day, the great city of Babylon, it says in Revelation, was destroyed. It fell just in one day. And some people, I read a book not too long ago, about a couple of years ago, and it talks about the fall of Babylon. And it's a pretty good argument that, we actually, if you got Rome and Greek before, Greece before them, these empires controlled the world, okay? Well, we are actually part of this culture. Our government, our laws, even our language comes out of these two empires, more than the Persians. And so that being said, because we come from that culture, we're almost like an extension of this ancient governments that controlled the world at their time. And, people say, well, America's not an imperialistic empire. No, we're not. But if you think about what we do, we got troops all over the world. That's what Rome did. That's what Greece did. And so we take the language and back it down and say, well, we just got them there in case there's problems. And then you hear people criticizing some of our political leaders and say we shouldn't be fighting everybody's war. Well, the Romans learned a long time ago, if you're going to be able to have commerce and be able to travel the seas and be able to make money and get food supplies, like for us oil, then there's got to be peace in the world. Otherwise, when your ships go out, they'll sink them, you know. And so the Romans decided to just control the world, and they used massive armies, and they were very well trained. They built roads, you know, all roads lead to Rome is a way to describe that. You know, they built roads for their troops to march on and for their wheat and wine to be shipped in, because they're just one city-state. They were not that big. There were other city-states in Italy, but Rome was not very big, but they were very powerful, and they did it through the military. And what they did was basically control the empires that they had. And before them, it was Alexander the Great. And they learned from him. And once he was defeated by the Romans, of course, he was already dead, but once the Greek Empire broke up, the Romans just took over. And so they were the next empire to come into being. So when we talk about the different beasts in Daniel, the last one, most people believe is the resurrection of Rome. When we see the 10 heads in Revelation with the horns and all that stuff, most people believe it's a 10-nation conglomerate. Well, when the European nation got started back in the 90s, when they formed together, there were 12 stars on their flag. And I remember reading some of the books, and they were criticizing those who said, well, the European, thing is, that's the beast, because we were trying to find out who's going to be. And it did break up. There's still some nations in it. And I don't know how many are in it now, but, the euro is their currency. And, of course, we have the U.S. dollar. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But getting back to your question, when we go through Revelation, we just have to do our homework, come up with answers, speculations. And it's good to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there. Tons and tons of books. Videos, my goodness, the videos. One of the most convincing videos, I don't have it now, but one of my members had it, talked about Israel and how she is the marker for what God's doing. And it went back and it traced it since 1948 when they came back as a nation. They were reestablished as a nation. And it traced all the events. And then what he did was talk about the events in the Bible, and he showed how they lined up. And so Israel is a key marker, and it says that generation in 1948 would not pass away before Christ came back. So if we use the number 80 years or whatever the lifespan is, people born in 1948, then somewhere between 1948 and 2028 would be an estimation of, all this happening. Who knows? Because Jesus also said nobody knows, and he wasn't permitted to tell us. So, if that's the case, we don't have much time. 8, 10 years. But if a generation is considered to be longer, well, here, think about this. In the book of Psalms, what does it say in Psalms 90 about a man's lifespan is what? 70, maybe 4? How long is that? 70 to 80 years. So the Jews looked at a long lifespan of 80 years. So if Israel was reestablished in 1948, but, since we don't know for sure, we could go right on through 2028, 2030, and Israel, in God's timing, could be dissolved and brought back later for a future generation. We don't know. Our concern is not to predict when he's coming. That is not what Jesus said we should be doing. The disciples asked the question, what will be the sign of your return, and what will be the things that, to look for? And he said, don't look for that. He said, here's some things you can kind of watch for, but don't worry about the time. But he did say, as it was in the days of Noah. And he said they were eating and drinking and just doing their own thing, had no clue that the flood was coming. And he says that's the way when the Son of Man comes, like lightning, like a thief in the night. And I've had people, steal from me on my property when I lived down in the low country. And it made me mad to know somebody came on my property and stole something. But I can't imagine, a thief calling me up and saying, Bobby, I'm going to be at your house tonight at 12 o'clock. And I said, that's good. I'd be looking forward to it. So when he comes through the door, he would think he hit Custer's last stand because I'm going to let him have it, So thieves don't do that. They sneak in. They go. Jesus says he'll come like a thief in the night, unannounced, he said, the least time when you expect it, he said, I'll come back. And he'll come for us, which we refer to often as the rapture. And then when he comes in the eastern sky, the return of Christ, two separate events. When he comes then, it says, every eye will see him and people's hearts will melt with fear. And he'll come in the eastern sky. That's the reason why your tombstones all face the east. I don't know if you ever noticed that in a cemetery, but Christian cemeteries traditionally have their cemetery tombstones aligned so they face the east. So the headstone faces the east. So when you rise up, you're looking at Jesus in the face. That's just what church did. Catholics did it. We do it. Y'all don't have a cemetery. I advise you not to start one. I could write a book on cemeteries. They can get you in all kinds of trouble.
Do you know what the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard is?
What is it? You're looking at her like she knows.
Cemeteries generally have
Perpetual
perpetual care.
care.
Go to Charleston, there are churches down there with graveyards.
Yeah.
And they do not
Have perpetual care.
have perpetual care. They are
Ours that we had at Ridge, we used volunteers, but we got where we couldn't find any volunteers. Then we tried to hire somebody, and they wanted like $800 a cut, and it was only an acre or a little over an acre. So I said, look, I like to cut grass. Yeah, it was. But I cut it for $300, and then I give the money to my grandson who was in college, and and some people said, you should do it for free. You're the preacher. I said, no, you come out here and run this weed eater and this. I had a zero turn. I could get through probably half of it. But
Still got money.
well, anyway, go back to John, 1 John. Chapter 2, I'm sorry. Chapter 2 and verse 18. I was on the wrong page. 1 John 2:18. Dear children, this is the last hour. Now this is John. He also wrote the book of Revelation. So I don't think he's in exile yet, but he writes this letter to Christians, and listen to what he says. This is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Now I want you to notice it's a little a. So this is not the beast, okay? It's a little a. Is coming. Even now, many, look at that, many antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. All right, let's read a little bit further. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. But you have anointing from the Holy One, and all of you know the truth. I do not write to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie comes from the truth. And then he goes on to talk about what an antichrist is. Who is the liar? It is the man who denies that Jesus is the Christ. There's your clue. Okay? So there are a lot of people that deny that Jesus is the Messiah or the Son of God. Those are antichrists, little a's. They're not the Antichrist as we know it, okay? Such a man is the Antichrist. He denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father, and whoever acknowledges the Son has the Father also. And then it says here, make sure that you remain in what you've heard from the beginning. And then over in chapter 4, it says to test the spirits. One of the things we're going to have to do as we approach the end of time, if we're living, is there's going to be people, and I shared this with some of y'all in the church council, when you get ready to look for a pastor, it takes a lot harder to make sure, because, like I said, when I was in seminary, I ran across a preacher that was a Calvinist, and to me, not to win people to Jesus, to me is a heresy. That's the way I look at it. John Calvin was wrong. He did some good things, but he was wrong on that. Jesus commanded us to do it. So when you're talking to pastors in the future, ask them, who do you believe Jesus is? Ask them theological questions. Now, don't ask them if you don't know yourself, but I'm sure most of y'all do. But ask them those questions. When I came into the ministry at Burnetown, my pastor took me before the association and called for a examination. And I had pastors ask me about the Lord's Supper, who Jesus was, who God was. Sounds like simple questions. But, you'd be surprised what you hear from some people, And when I was in seminary, I ran across a few people that said, they believed that the Spirit came on Jesus when he got to being a man, but when he was little, he's just an average kid. Well, that's not what the Bible says, but that's what he believed. So you got cults out there like the Jehovah Witnesses and the Mormons. See, people say the Mormons are Christians. No, they're not. They're Jesus, and is not our Jesus. And the Apostle Paul said, anyone preaching another Jesus than the one that I taught you, he said, let him be accursed. Because there's a lot of people. So that's the key point, okay? Now, with that background, we have Antichrist in our culture today. We have them in the churches. And they work against God's work. And if we stay firm to the faith, firm to the word, they'll leave. Because one thing Satan can't do is be around Bible preaching and Bible teaching. He just can't handle it on a consistent basis. He can still give you trouble, but All right, verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. Dragon is a symbol for Satan, okay? The second beast comes out of the earth. Here's a little paragraph I put here for you. If the sea mentioned as the source of the first beast represents the first beast as a Gentile, the reference to the second beast is coming from the earth indicates that this character, who is later described as a false prophet, is a creature of earth rather than kind of spiritual being from heaven. To argue that the earth means Palestine and that therefore this character is a Jew is reading into the passage more than it says. His geographic origin and his racial connection are not mentioned. We don't have any idea where he's born, what his geological ancestry and stuff really is. As a lamb, it says, the description of him as a lamb seems to indicate that he is a religious character, a conclusion supported by his being named a prophet. His speaking as a dragon indicates that he is motivated by the power of Satan, who is the dragon. And he exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So you got 2 beasts. You have a political person. He's the big gun. But the thing about the way God created us, because he created us in his image, we have a spiritual nature that has to be fed, has to be filled with something. So if you don't worship Jesus, and when I taught world religions, I told my class this, because I couldn't get up there and preach Christianity because I had to talk about all the other religions. I said, but the reason, someone asked me in class, why is there so many religions? I said, because we're all spiritual beings. And I said, even that young lady said she was spiritual but not religious. And I said, you're still, and in her own way, she was trying to say, I want to feel my spirituality. I want to sense an awareness of a divine being, helping me get through life and so forth where I'm going. That's innate, to use that word, for all of us. Every single one. That little great grandbaby I got has a soul. He has an awareness of God. He's not conscious or aware of it yet, so he's not held accountable for his sins. Now, there will come a day when he will reach that point that he'll understand more of his spiritual nature. And because we're sinners, you can see it in the children, even when they're tiny babies. He wants to be held all the time. So guess what happens if you don't get held? Yeah, I'll call over there sometime, talk to my grandson, and I hear something go, ah! I said, Devin, that sounds strange, son. I said, every time I call over there, I said, you ain't feeding that baby? Papa, I don't know what his problem is. I said, well, you're learning. I said, how much do y'all hold him? He said, all the time. And I laughed because we went through that. We all have been there. And they're so precious you want to. But you can find yourself that little one has a selfishness where he will use it against you at 3 o'clock in the morning. Or, get you out of bed when you don't want to get out of bed. But long story short, because of that spiritual nature, people are going to worship something like an idol, a person, and it can even be themselves. When an atheist says they're an atheist, they don't believe in God, what they're saying is there's a designated authority in their life, so they're their own God. They won't use that word, but that's what they're saying. And just a funny trivia thing, I didn't know this till I took church history, but in the first part, when these Christians were being persecuted so much for about the first, probably 100 to close to 300 years, the Roman people called Christians atheists. You see, and this word theist means God, and when you put an A in front of it, It means no God. So when the Christians refused to worship the Roman gods, which were government, and then the emperor, who was a god, he declared that he was a god. And you had to pay homage to him. You had to give an offering to him. And if you didn't, and guess what they called him? They called him Lord. Caesar had to be referred to as Lord. So Christians got in trouble by not acknowledging Caesar as Lord, and so they called him atheists. I thought that was hilarious because today that's turned, and the Christians call people who don't believe in our God, what? Atheists. So it shows you history has different time periods how people turn things around. So that being said, you got a political beast, and then you got one who's referred to as a prophet. He's the false religious guy. He's also referred to as a beast. And in Daniel, you got the big horn and you got the little horn. He also mentions these two, but he doesn't give us much information about him. But Revelation says this prophet is a religious person who is over religious principles and will cause the people of the earth. It's interesting, the founder of communism, his name was Karl Marx. This is what he said he's an atheist. Here's what he said about religion. It's the opium of the people. What is opium used for? A drug. Yeah, give you a high and control people. And so the communists basically have a form of godliness, and even Hitler did this. I mentioned that a few weeks ago. And so religion is vital. If you want to get somebody mad, attack their faith. And if you don't believe that, then look at Islam. Allah Akbar. They believe they're dying for their God, for their Allah. And there's 2 billion of them, and they'll kill you because of their God. Christians, back during the Crusades, we killed, Islam to take over our holy relics place, stuff like that. There's a little more political stuff there and stuff like that, but all I'm saying is we've seen this before. It's in the world where a political entity will use its political power and its religious power, okay? Now, let me show you something. And if this doesn't make sense, then y'all can stop me anytime and I'll quit. But this is not in Revelation. This just shows you where we're headed. In 325 AD, I mentioned it before, the Roman Empire defeated, it was divided, and Constantine defeated everything. Anyway, they centralized their political power, and they centralized their religion. They did away with the ancient religions and said Christianity is now the government religion. Well, there you go. You got a political figure, and you got a religious figure. You follow this? These two worked in concert to kill people. And if you didn't believe the way they did, they'd go to war. So in Constantinople, which is the eastern part, which is in Turkey, the church was divided. They believed one thing about Jesus, and in Rome, the Christians over here believe something else about Jesus. We come from this mindset. They believe that Jesus was a human being that just had God come on and do what he needed to do, but he wasn't really God. And there's millions of people that believe this. The Russians, the Orthodox Greek Church believes this. Okay, so they know how to use religion and political power to control their people. And if you don't listen, they pull the sword out. And we've got this in Revelation. And in Rome, they did the same thing. So when we get to 1517, guess what? The Christians who were Protestants, they fought the Catholic Church because they were tired of them telling them what to do. They said, you're wrong, we're right. So there was millions of people died because of religion. And one of the reasons America got formed was to get away from all of that. And believe it or not, in South Carolina and Georgia, we were anti-church for a long time. The Bible Belt didn't get started to the late 1700s after American Revolution. Before that, people just didn't want churches. And if they had a church, they wanted the preacher to be under their control. That's why you have all these little churches everywhere. Because the families who settled in this area started a tradition, we'll control our religion. We're tired of the Pope. We're tired of, Episcopal. We're tired of all of them. We'll control the church. So now, if people don't like their preacher, they just get rid of them. Methodists move them around every 4 years. And that's a tradition, believe it or not. And you say, why we do what we do? It comes all the way back to here. But before that, this is what controlled the world. So all the bloody wars of Europe and things like that had religion at the root of them. Because the religious power has to convince people they need to fight. So when a man hears that God's on their side, and that God, and the preacher gets up there and says, and God wants you to fight, it's just like an imam for Islam. They'll fight. And that's where we are. So what does that got to do with Revelation? Well, it's got a lot to do. Because these two figures that I mentioned earlier, the political beast and religious beast, if they don't work together, they can't control people. And it says that the religious prophet will cause people to worship the political power. And that's how it's going to work. Now, the thing with us in the world today, we have Islam, 2.2 billion. We have the Catholic Church, and then Protestants, which we all have the same Bible, so to speak. Not exactly, but majority of, we believe in Jesus, blah, blah, blah. But, we got 2 billion of us. Then we got Muslims, Hindu and Buddhist and all these other religions in the world. So I've always scratched my head and said, how is this guy, getting everybody together? And I mentioned last week, there's some new religions forming where people said, like I preached this morning, you can all go to heaven, many ways to heaven, worship how you want to. But he will add the connotation and the use that the political leader has to be honored, just like Caesar was called Lord. Okay? Everybody with me? Where are we going? Now, that in mind, look at verse 13. And this is what gets interesting. And he performed great and miraculous signs, and it says, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, the political beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So the miracle may be an imitation of Pentecost, or it may be regarded similar to Elijah's miracles, or to destructive fire coming out of the mouth of the two witnesses a few weeks ago we looked at. The scriptures indicate that the devil does have power to do miracles, and that by their use, he deceives people into worshiping the beast. Now, this is just for your thought, but our government has been putting an awful lot of military satellites into space. And one of the technologies that has really advanced that you don't hear much about is laser weapons, where they can shoot a beam down and wipe out things like that and so forth. Laser technology is further advanced than we've been told. I could see a political entity just turning that on and zapping what needs to be zapped. Centers of communication, infrastructure, resistance of any kind. Who knows? Who was it? Not Reagan, but Trump started what? The space thing? What was it called? Yeah. And if you read what was in that, they're talking about these weapons that are like no other weapons and have the ability to do things. So all I'm saying is, as we advance, to get fire to come out of the sky, the only one I ever knew that did that was God. With Elijah and, other occasions. So that being said, Satan's able to do these miracles, but then again, it may be a miracle in the sense that he does supernaturally cause some things happen that we can't explain. I'm just saying the technology is there, that this is a feasibility, possibility, in that time. Of course, when the beast and the, little beast, or whatever you want to call him, tribulation is 7 years. This is where we'll know, I'm not planning on being here, but for some reason I am here. I already know what's going to happen. Run for the hills. But during this time, if you're a Christian, believe in the rapture, that's good. But suppose other Christians see it in the middle, as I said, and some see it at the end and the return of Christ here. One thing for sure, Christ is coming here. We know that. That's for certain. But others say, no, it's later on. But for right now, these antichrists are going to be in power for these 7 years. The first 3.5 years, the people who are here are going to think there's no one like the beast. You're going to be impressed by him, the way he talks, the way he speaks. He's going to be able to persuade most of the earth that I'm the dude you've been looking for so long. There'll be some kind of calamity that will happen that'll trigger all this, that'll scare the bejesus out of everybody. In other words, they'll be scared to death and turn to him for salvation. And because of his political clout, he'll be able to bring the nations together and economically get the earth back where it needs to be. And because of that, people worship the beast, because the second beast will cause people to say, hey, look, he's taking care of you. Why do you want to fight against him? Just like Caesar was Lord, this guy is almost like a god because he's taking care of you. How do you think the people in Germany gave in to Hitler when he got started? Do y'all know the story? How did an evil man like Hitler take over Germany? Huh? Yeah, he fed them. And Volkswagen means the people's car. And what he did, very slick. That's why a lot of people think Hitler was the Antichrist, which we know he's not. But there's some people that tried to work it in there, because everything he did is like a portrait of what's going to be done in the end time. And, I've read a lot of history about the Nazis and, his upper echelon and all of his leaders around him, and they were sick. But one thing he did do, like Mark said, the Germans came out of World War I. Their so-called empire was gone. The Ottoman Empire was destroyed, which they were the Arabs who helped them fight, against the Allies. But anyway, Germany was in pitiful shape. And so after World War I, Hitler and some very powerful people in Germany realized the best way to get their agenda and take back over their territory would be able to feed the people, to get the economy back, get the currency back. And so they created government jobs and created government industries. The People's Car became a big thing. That People's Car factories, they were producing tanks and everything at the beginning of World War II. They switched them from Volkswagens to Panzer tanks. But anyway, because they had the machinery in. And the thing that I'm saying to you is, we've already seen this, but not on the scale of this beast and religious beast. I mentioned 2 weeks ago, he got rid of his religious opposition. He established a state religion where he said he was the head of the church and he was the head of the government. How about that? And any preacher who was recognizing what he was doing, opposed him, you quietly disappeared. Thousands upon thousands, Christian preachers like myself, they would have come in the doors, picked me up and carried me off. You'd never see me again. And Gail and I were watching a documentary one Sunday afternoon. It was an older German lady, and they were interviewing her. And she said, they asked her, said, why would you, because she talked about her neighbor being picked up in the night because he had said something against Hitler, and they came and got him in the middle of the night. And so the reporter said, why would you and your people fall for something like this? And she had tears in her eyes. She says, we were hungry. We didn't have anything to support us. He gave to us jobs. He gave to us an economy. He said he looked out for Germany. But, he never revealed to them what his agenda was to take this machine that he was building up and try to conquer all of Europe. And by the way, all the areas he conquered and territory was the old Roman Empire. Almost identical. Every territory he took over. Then you had the Japanese out west, and of course they worked together. But I'm just saying, history, this has already happened. Right now, I don't know what Putin's doing, but I know one thing, he's getting whooped pretty bad by the Ukrainians, from what I understand. I don't think he's the Antichrist. I think he's a precursor to see what, could happen. But he's not smart enough, and he's Russian and everything else. So, and a lot of people don't like him. Let's go back to this. 3 ways that the beast gets people to follow. Performs miracles, verses 13, 14. Threat of death in verse 15. And the economic boycott in verses 16 and 17. You see, it says in Revelation, and let me read those verses to you. It says in Revelation at the end there in verses that are following, and he performed great miraculous signs. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And then it said he was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. And notice that verse 18 says, this calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. Now, give me y'all's personal opinion of the number 666. Are you afraid of that number? Would you have it on your car tag? If you got it from the state and they had 666 on your tag, would you use it? Or say, could you give me a different tag? Huh? You wouldn't think about it? All right. Yeah. Well, that might be true. Don't mess with them. The devil's riding up there. And they said, well, you've been driving. Looks like the devil. Here's some interesting things that from history we've seen. In the Roman Empire, it's been estimated that 7 or 6 to 8 of the people walking the streets of the Roman Empire were slaves. Those slaves were marked. They were marked on their hands, their right hands, and then they were marked on their foreheads, so that people knew who their owners were. So they really couldn't go anywhere unless their master gave them authority to do that. So if they tried to run away, of course, it wouldn't take long for people to see the mark, and they would take them back. We do that to animals. If you're raised on a farm with cows or cattle, remember seeing the old Westerns? You had to brand of that stuff. Do what? They brand them. Today, people use tattoos to brand themselves, and you don't know who's who. Look like they've been dipped in a bucket of many colorful. Good scrubbing. Oh, by the way, in my ministerial experience in my first church, I was visiting an old Navy veteran, not to pick on the Navy, but he was laying up in the bed and he had his shirt off. And he was laying up in there and he had to look like a big blue blob or something on his chest. And I thought he'd been hit with a pole or something. And I said to him, and he's like 75 or 80. And I said to him, I said, is that why you're in the hospital? No, preacher, that wasn't a very good tattoo when I got it. Plus, with my skin getting older and my weight changing. And I said, well, was it a ship that sank or what was it, And he said it just wasn't, because it all just blended together. You didn't know what it was. Because this skin that we have, and some of you already know it, I know it, it's becoming wrinkly. And if you got pictures drawn on it, those pictures get wrinkly, But going back to this beast, Paul and Thessalonians say that this person will be blasphemous against the true Christian faith. In other words, he will blaspheme God. He will deny that God, is a true God. And, of course, his prophet will cause us to worship him. Second thing about him, he will cause a delusion, the Bible says, to come over the whole earth. Now, when you look up that word delusion, it talks about a great deception. We don't know exactly what this delusion could be, but it says it will cause people to almost fall into his hands. It's a deceptive work, but Paul says it'll be a great delusion that will be a part of his power and his control. Part of that delusion would be him doing miracles and being dead and yet coming back to life. A person who's what do they call him? Not a magician, but what's the other specialty in magic work? They do illusionist. If you ever see those illusionists, they can make an airplane disappear and they'll have a 747 on the stage or a picture and, smoke and mirrors. That would be a delusion, okay? That being said, his power will be centered around economics. So if you're not willing to get into his system, you won't be able to buy, sell, or own anything. In other words, he will control you in the economy. Now, right now, we still have cash. But I don't know if you know about the cash, but it's drying up very fast. The banks are deliberately drying it up. When the ATM shifted to $20 bills, they used to have 5 and 10s. When they shifted to 20, it stopped a lot of people who have little bank accounts from taking money out of the ATM. I had a banker one day, I asked her about this, and I said, let me ask you a question. I said, I'm not going to rob your bank, but on any one given day, where's all the cash? And she says, well, you'll be surprised. We collect it. And if we didn't go out and collect it and bring it back, there wouldn't be anything here. And she says, we're in the process of electronically keeping up, particularly with large businesses and stuff, with money. So there is a process, and there's many books. You can go and read this on the internet. Much information about how they're going to do this. And then there's things like the World Economic Group that's meeting, and this is not the 20-power nation, but this is a group of economists. A guy by the name of Schwab heads it up. And I just recently came across this. And what they're doing with this COVID-19, it gave them an opportunity to reset the economies. And what they're doing is trying to unify currency so that we come under one currency.
Joe Biden just signed an executive order that authorized the implementation of a national Bitcoin currency.
Yeah, the Bitcoins. And you can invest in Bitcoins. What are Bitcoins? They're digital money. And they call them coins, but they're not coins that you can hold in your hand. I went ahead and bought $5 worth just to see what would happen. I actually making a few bucks on it since some of the things have changed.
Call it Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It's leasing the apartment building I worked in, came in and had this big machine they bought in, and they had to add extra airflow and all this kind of stuff like a computer thing, and they would Bitcoin mine. We've done several Bitcoin mining places electrical.
So my question to us as Christians, these are things that will indicate that this person is either alive and working behind the scenes, or because, see, Satan doesn't move real fast. He's deceptive. He moves very slow. He's patient, the day that Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit, I believe Satan had been in that garden a long time. But he finally, saw them looking at the food. And he gave them a chance, and he tempted them, and of course they bit him, what took place. And I believe that this person will be very powerful. Now, the 3 6s. Man was created on the 6th day. So 6 in biblical literature, and 6 in even outside biblical literature from the old days. 6 is always a number representative of man, because we were created on the 6th day. So to have 3 6s says that this person, number one, has great power. And like God, 777 is some numbers that are used for him as creator. He's the counterpart. And because he has a religious and desires to be worshiped, he's going to be like Christ. But he's going to use political power and religious power to control people. So the 666 says it's his number. It doesn't mean you're going to have a 666 on your hand and a 666 on your forehead. It just means it's a spiritual way, once again, a code of letting you know that this person will be like a Trinity. That not only does he have the prophet, but he has a spirit, the demons and everything else, and they work together in concert. So the 666 is his number. But what I like is verse number 18. It says, if you have wisdom, discern his number. So the Bible gives us opportunity that we can try to examine and see if we can see it coming before it gets here. In the book of Kings, and then again over in Chronicles, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but I'll bring it fresh in your memory. When Solomon was in his glory, they controlled all the Middle East. He was very powerful. Chariots, military. He controlled the trades. He built all kinds of things. He built the temple. It was the glory days of Israel. The kings who lived on his border, like in Saudi Arabia, one of the queens was the Queen of Sheba. And the Bible says that each year they had to pay money to Israel, and in gold. And for doing that, Solomon guaranteed their safety, their security, and opened up the trade borders. We do that today. That's why we give money to all these governments. We say, why are they doing this? Well, it's just the way powers work in the political world. But it says in both passages, they both reference the same event, that when they totaled up the gold, it totaled to 666 talents. And I was reading that one night, and there you have wisdom. you have the verse. You have the number. You have the situation, and the situation was there was a central power where money was coming into the coffers of Israel. All I'm saying is we see that this has been done before. A very powerful leader controlling his world by the use of people paying, monetary tribute to them. And so it's happened. We just don't, a lot of us don't like history and we don't study it. I'm kind of the other way around. Gail will tell you I'm a history nut. I read it all the time and taught church history in college. And in fact, when I was going to seminary, I made straight A's in it, and the professor come up and said, "You're the only student I have that seems to be interested." I said, "I am. I love history." And he said, "You might consider it teaching one day." And then I got the opportunity to teach, and I just learned more, because when you're teaching, you got to study more. And one of the things I learned about church and government is there's been some pretty dark times in history, not unlike what we're going to see here. But this will be so powerful that many people who are living then, who consider themselves the saints, will, fall for it. And so they're not going to do that. They're going to fall for it. But
say the average person will not be, not be,
yeah, you can say that.
right, not be.
Well, let me throw something at you. It's pretty hard, and don't take this the wrong way. If you're at home and you're resisting, and you got these children and grandkids, and they're hungry, and Papa and Daddy says, "We're not going down there," and you grew some food, but the government came and tore up your garden, went in your house and stole your meat, and took it all out, took your car away from you. You can't finance, you can't refinance, and they started controlling you, and you still said, "We'll just starve to death." Knowing what I've heard about Bill and his family, you wouldn't do that. All right. And this is from history. When Lincoln gave Sherman the orders to come through Georgia and South Carolina, that's exactly what he did. I'm reading a book right now. He went into people's, and he says, "I will crush you." And they took the animals and shot them in front of them. They raped mostly black women, not white women, but black women. It was a bad time. And when you read this stuff, and we've kind of covered it up, our own government did that to break the will of the people. And so they controlled the economy, and people starved to death, and it's a bad time. So there's tyrants that's been in our own country. So, I'm afraid of big government. I'm afraid of a government that'll put the military in the streets. And that's the reason why all of our citizens being armed is the best defense against the government out of control. And what happened to Ukraine, they didn't have enough weapons. They're getting them now, but, So, anyway, I'm going to fight. And someone says, "What's going to happen anyway?" Well, I'm not going to sit there and say, I'm going to surrender to a guy who thinks God doesn't exist. And, I'll just live in the hills of West Virginia, where some of y'all are from, and we'll fight,
It's going to be like the hermit guy who went back to his little cabin, that they told him he couldn't go back to. He's on somebody's land. He's had it for like so many years. He went back. He went back to him, and they arrested him again. He's been living off the land, and
Yeah.
he said the man who owned that property before the guy that owns it now told him he could stay there.
But there's not enough land for all of us to do that, When New York City empties out, we got 8 million people roaming the woods, So I don't know how it's going to end out. All I know is that this is the way we see from this vision that John had, that this will be one of the events that happens during the tribulation. Before people say, "Well, I'll never take that mark," we've already done it. We got barcodes, we got social security numbers, we got driver's license. The last ID we got, the governor resisted it for a few years, but the federal government said, if you're going to do any federal money coming into your state, you've got to get this federal ID. So your driver's license now. So when they pull it up, they know everything about you. Your medical records are in Washington now. And Obamacare so now they got in charge of my medical records. They got in charge of my ID. They know my past. They know my history. And they track us on the internet. So if you become a resistant, so we're already being controlled. Yeah.
He don't have a credit card.
He don't have anything. He's old school that believed in what the Bible says. But the thing is, we know you can't function in this world with all these things. You know it and I know it. Every time I go to the doctor, let me see your ID. I said, I showed it to you last time. We have to look at it every time. I said, well, I haven't changed. If you're going to see, but if they got control of your medical records and everything else, then, you know. And Medicare, how many of y'all on Social Security? Okay. What would y'all have done during the COVID crisis if they come out, and I thought they were going to do it, and they didn't do it. If they come out and said, if you're on Medicare, and I mean, you know, well, not just Medicare, but Medicare if you got Social Security. But if you're on Medicare and Social Security, if you don't get within 6 months, your funds will be cut off. Now people says, well, our congressman would go to our defense. They'll put it, you know, fight it to the Supreme Court. Do you know how long that takes? Can you do without your Social Security income now? Some of us could. I can't. I mean, I've got other sources, but not that much, you know. I waited to the last minute to get my Social Security. I want to get all I can get, you know. So I guess what I'm saying to you is trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Acknowledge him in all your ways. And he said he would direct our steps. That's all we can do. Don't worry about it. Don't get anxious about it. Y'all know more information than the average person sitting down the street because y'all come to church and you hear teaching that helps you to see how the Bible is true. And then you see it when you go out in the streets and you turn on your TV and you see it happening before your eyes. So, you know.
The reason he has cable so he can watch baseball.
Is that right? Is that what he said?
He'll tell you.
Okay. Well, let's have prayer before we go. And don't forget, we got Bible study Wednesday night. We're starting the book of Ephesians. And I do those Wednesday night Bible studies a lot like I do this study in Revelation. We get into real deep material. It's not just reading verses, but it's actually looking at structure.